brain.
What is it that makes somebody violent?
And profile notorious psycho killers, revealing the most evil mind. A scale exists to measure the darkest corners of human behavior, acts of evil. It weighs the criminal mind and the crime, from impulsive murderers to serial killers. Science now has a tool to determine who are the most evil. Deranged killers, unaware of what's real and what's imagined. In rural Wisconsin, Ed Gein hears his dead mother's voice calling him to act. He robs graves to harvest the skulls and flesh of his victims to bring his mother back to life. Terrifying upstate New York, Arthur Shawcross claims he has a break with reality before brutally murdering nearly a dozen women in the 80s. In his bizarre Philadelphia home, Gary Heidnik holds sex slaves captive in his basement. For 5 months, he rapes, electrocutes, and then murders them. Their acts are incomprehensible, evil. Psychotic killers remain one of our greatest fears and mysteries. But each one is different. Now there is a scale that measures the different degrees of evil. It weighs a killer's motive, method, and madness. The more heinous the crime and the more rational the perpetrator, the higher the criminal is placed on the scale.
Evil is a word that people use when they refer to an act that is breathtakingly horrible.
Creator of this scale, Dr. Michael Stone, forensic psychiatrist, Columbia University.
A scale of ever-increasing inhumanity, the most consistently awful or evil or inhumane, the ones who represent the greatest danger and threat to society on a permanent basis.
To shed light on the causes of the violent psychotic, Dr. Stone asks key questions.
What are the personality characteristics? How many of them have predisposition to mental illness? The presence of schizophrenia raises the likelihood of committing violent acts.
To determine their degrees of evil, one must consider their state of mind at the time of their crime and what led them to that point. Dr. Stone will investigate these murderous minds and place each of these killers on his scale.
In order for me to understand the nature of the person who I feel deserves to be referred to as an evil person, I have to study their history and look at their whole life.
Such is the case with Ed Gein.
He became something of a poster child for the psychotic savage killer.
But where does he lie on the scale? For 10 years, he would read the obituaries, looking for women who had recently died. At night, he would exhume their bodies, taking the parts he desired. The organs and the bones of the dead littered his home. He used them to make bowls, chair seats, necklaces, lampshades. This was Ed Gein's life before he turned to murder. Plainfield, Wisconsin was a quiet place, miles from the nearest city. But in 1957, people drove for hours to this small town to discover if the horrifying rumors of evil in Plainfield were true. The truth was even more gruesome than they could have imagined. The shocking revelations began when a shopkeeper vanished from work, leaving only a trail of blood on the floor. Clues led police to this house on the outskirts of town, the home of lifelong recluse Ed Gein. All the doors were locked except for the entrance to the shed. Inside, the decapitated body of the shopkeeper hanging upside down. Her head was in a burlap sack. Her heart had been cut out and stored in a plastic bag. But when police searched Ed Gein's house, they discovered that this grisly scene was only the beginning. His home was a monument to death and depravity. They found at least 10 human skulls, some wrapped in plastic, some placed casually under furniture. Mounted on the wall, the decaying faces of 9 women, some made up with lipstick. Hidden under the bed, police found a shoebox containing the severed remains of female genitalia. Every room in Ed Gein's house was filthy and marked with evil, except one, his mother's bedroom.
What kind of a man did you know?
Well, Manning's a nice man, just like anybody else. The only difference, I'd say, the man, he seems to be odd.
At some point in his life, Ed Gein lost his touch with reality, which led to particularly gruesome and twisted acts.
The scale of evil takes into account the thin line between sanity and madness, reserving spots lower on the scale for those truly unaware of their actions. Dr. Stone asks himself crucial questions. Was Ed Gein aware of what he did? And if not, what pushed his mind over the brink of madness? Ed Gein was born in 1906. His home was dominated by his devout and severe mother. She was convinced that men were lustful creatures, driven to sin by their desires. She was determined that her son, Eddie, be different. Every day she read to him from the scriptures, describing a time when a flood would come to wash away women's sins. Despite her severity, Ed Gein was devoted to his mother. For nearly 40 years, he spent every day with her, listening, learning.
This constant reinforcement fed his mental illness, gave his delusions shape.
His mother died of cancer in 1945, when Ed was 39. He was devastated and alone. His only company, his own thoughts.
The death of the mother was overwhelming. That may have been the time in his life when he snapped. And snapping in Ed Gein's case would mean the transition from an already very super shy, aloof, schizoid man, unable to make emotional contact with other people. He may have had a break at that time where he became grossly psychotic and remained so for the rest of his days.
Ed Gein began to hear his mother talking to him. Just before he fell asleep, his mother's voice would sound in his ears. He started having hallucinations. The woods outside his home fed his madness. He saw vultures in the branches, faces in the leaves. He became convinced he could bring his mother back to life by the power of his own will. He began to steal parts of human bodies from graves. He thought that he was an instrument of God, that God had called him to murder.
Ed Gein wanted fresh flesh, and so he began to kill women. He would dress in dresses made of human skin, and he would then become a transvestite who dressed not in women's clothes, but in women's bodies. I don't know of anybody else who can make that claim.
Ed Gein was diagnosed as mentally ill and declared incompetent to stand trial. He spent the remainder of his life in Central State Hospital, where he died of cancer in 1984. Years after his case shattered the calm of the small Wisconsin town, he was asked about his mother. He said, "There was no one else like her in the world."
He has less of a grip on what he's doing than somebody who is not psychotic.
One factor in placing someone like Ed Gein on the scale of evil is madness, or what modern science calls psychosis. A state in which people can't distinguish between the real world and the imagined. Ed Gein exhumed the bodies of women and mutilated their corpses. He then slaughtered and decapitated 2 women. Ed Gein was deemed psychotic at the time of his murders. Therefore, Dr. Stone considers him less responsible for his gruesome acts. If he were not psychotic and committed murder, he would rank higher on the scale.
On an evil scale, I always put the men who are clearly psychotic on a lower number because I think that their psychosis removes from them the element of scheming and cold malice that a person who has all his senses is capable of.
Dr. Stone places Ed Gein at a level 13 out of 22 on his scale of evil. There are special levels reserved for killers with psychosis on Dr. Stone's scale. The most shocking psycho killers are not necessarily the most evil.
All right, please.
Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Michael Stone has developed a scale that he believes measures human evil. There are 22 levels. The lower numbers represent acts that he considers less evil.
By the time you get to 11, 12, and beyond, all the way through 22, you're dealing with an evil person.
Like Ed Gein, who harvested human flesh to restore the spirit of his dead mother. He is only a 13 out of 22 levels because he was psychotic and unaware of his crimes. Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento, begins a 4-day rampage, shooting and killing a pregnant woman, and then a second woman, her son, and 2 others to drink their blood because voices tell him to do so. He is only a level 17. Joseph Callinger hears God's voice telling him to kill his own son, then enlists his other son in the brutal torture of over 10 others and the murder of 1 woman. Callinger is a level 20.
These killers are considered not the most evil, like level 22, because they were psychotic when they killed.
People of the state of New York against Arthur Shaw.
In Rochester, Arthur Shawcross strangled 11 women, then ate some of their remains. He claims he had an out-of-body experience before choking his victims and was unaware of what he did. Was he in the throes of psychosis when he committed the crimes? But blaming murder on psychosis is controversial, and there are few experts who can make that diagnosis.
In each case, they are mixed up, and you have to put them in the right order so that they make the most sensible story. When people behave violently, there's always a question, well, the person has lost their mind so that they are mad. And then, on the other hand, there's this question of whether they are simply bad characters. I wanted to translate the mad versus bad distinction into science.
Dr. Paul Nestor is a professor of psychology at the University of Massachusetts. For years, he worked in a maximum security mental institution, evaluating hundreds of killers.
I was working as a mental health worker at a state hospital, and a very paranoid, psychotic patient shot to death his psychiatrist. It would make you extremely afraid of what a mental illness could drive someone to.
He is an expert on the most misunderstood and most feared type of murderer, the psychotic killer. People with psychosis can't distinguish between the real world and the imagined. They have hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia, and in the rare case, act out violently.
The patient is given a set of cartoon frames. Most people can put these cartoon frames into an order that makes sense.
In this case, playing with matches will start a fire that could get out of control and pose a danger for others. The arrangement shows the basic link between action and consequence.
People with psychosis have difficulties doing this subtest. They have difficulties trying to put these things in the right order and trying to understand cause and effect in a social arrangement.
Dr. Nestor's research helped clarify the link between social awareness and the psychotic urges that lead to violence.